When American Marines landed on the island in August 1942, they quickly realized that maps, training manuals, and previous combat experience meant very little here. The heat was relentless. Day and night, temperatures hovered near unbearable levels, soaking uniforms within minutes and draining strength from even the strongest soldiers. Many Marines later wrote that exhaustion arrived faster than fear. The jungle itself was thick beyond imagination. Towering trees blocked sunlight, while tangled vines and razor-sharp undergrowth limited visibility to just a few meters. In many areas, soldiers could not see the man walking 10 steps ahead of them. Movement was slow, noisy, and dangerous. Every step risked disease, insects, or hidden enemy positions. But the most terrifying aspect was the invisible enemy environment. Japanese troops did not need to reveal themselves. Sound behaved strangely in the jungle. Gunshots echoed unpredictably, footsteps disappeared, and voices seemed to come from nowhere. Marines reported hearing whispers, rustling leaves, or snapping branches, only to find nothing when they investigated. This constant uncertainty created intense psychological pressure. Rain turned trails into mud rivers, destroyed equipment, and spread malaria and dysentery. Soldiers fought not only each other, but fever, dehydration, and infection. Men collapsed without a single bullet fired. Supplies rotted. Weapons jammed. Time itself felt distorted beneath the jungle canopy. Guadalcanal was not a place where armies clashed in open formations. It was a dark, suffocating maze where survival depended on instinct, patience, and nerve. In this environment, fear did not come from what you could see, but from what you couldn't. And for both sides, the jungle ensured that every moment of the battle was fought on the edge of exhaustion and terror. Before Guadalcanal, the Japanese army did not see the United States as a serious battlefield opponent. For years, Japan's soldiers had been fighting and winning across China and Southeast Asia. They had faced poorly equipped forces, colonial armies, and opponents who often retreated quickly under pressure. These campaigns shaped a dangerous sense of confidence within Japanese command. Victory had come fast, and losses, though real, seemed acceptable. Japanese troops were battle-hardened. Many officers and enlisted men had survived brutal jungle fighting in China, Malaya, and the Philippines. They believed they understood close combat better than any Western army. In their view, discipline, endurance, and willingness to die for the emperor outweighed technology or numbers. This belief was reinforced by early victories against British and Dutch forces, which collapsed far faster than expected. American soldiers, by contrast, were widely dismissed as inexperienced. Japanese intelligence reports described U.S. Marines as physically soft, overly dependent on equipment, and lacking the mental toughness required for prolonged jungle warfare. The idea that Americans would endure hunger, disease, and constant fear without breaking was considered unrealistic. Many Japanese officers believed U.S. troops would retreat once casualties began to rise. There was also cultural misunderstanding. Japanese doctrine valued aggressive frontal assaults and spiritual resolve, while Americans were assumed to lack the fighting spirit necessary for close, chaotic combat. Hollywood images of comfort and luxury shaped false assumptions about American society and its soldiers. This underestimation would prove fatal. Guadalcanal was the first time Japanese forces met Americans who refused to withdraw, adapted rapidly, and fought with quiet determination. What began as confidence soon turned into confusion, and then fear. In the jungles of Guadalcanal, American Marines quickly abandoned the idea of fighting as a large, visible force. Instead, they adapted to the terrain by breaking down into small, flexible units. Fire teams and squads moved independently, often without clear front lines. This allowed Marines to slip through dense vegetation, strike unexpectedly, and vanish before the enemy could respond. Small unit raids became a defining feature of American jungle warfare. Patrols moved out at dawn or after sunset, guided by instinct rather than maps. These raids targeted supply routes, listening posts, and forward positions. The goal was not territorial gain, but disruption. Japanese units were denied rest, resupply, and any sense of safety. A single night raid could leave an enemy position abandoned by morning. Silence was treated as a weapon. Marines learned to communicate with hand signals, avoid unnecessary movement, and control breathing while lying in ambush for hours. Rifles were cleaned obsessively to prevent noise or malfunction. Even the snap of a twig could give away a position and mean death. Veterans later recalled that the jungle punished carelessness instantly. Hidden positions were carefully chosen. Marines used shallow foxholes, natural depressions, and fallen trees to disappear into the terrain. Camouflage was improvised from mud, leaves, and shadows. Japanese soldiers often walked within meters of American positions without realizing it. When contact was made, it was sudden and overwhelming. This method of movement turned the jungle into an ally. The Americans were rarely seen until they struck. For Japanese troops accustomed to open assaults and visible enemies, this style of warfare felt unnatural and deeply unsettling. Guadalcanal proved that survival in the jungle belonged not to the loud or the numerous, but to the quiet, patient, and unseen. Nightfall transformed Guadalcanal into a world of fear, especially for Japanese soldiers. In daylight, the jungle was dangerous, but predictable. At night, it became something else entirely. Visibility vanished, familiar landmarks disappeared, and sound distorted in the thick, humid air. This was when American Marines were most active. U.S. night patrols moved slowly and deliberately, often in total silence. Marines advanced in single file, spaced just far enough apart to avoid detection. Cigarettes were forbidden. Metal gear was taped or removed to prevent noise. Even whispered orders were avoided. For hours, patrols crawled through darkness, guided only by touch, memory, and instinct. These patrols rarely announced themselves. Instead, they waited. Marines set up ambushes along jungle trails, river crossings, and supply routes. When Japanese units moved at night, often believing darkness protected them, they walked directly into sudden, devastating fire. Attacks lasted seconds, not minutes. Then the Americans vanished back into the jungle, leaving confusion and casualties behind. The silence afterward was often worse than the attack itself. Japanese survivors described the terrifying uncertainty that followed, not knowing where the enemy had gone, or if they were still being watched. Flares and random gunfire provided no comfort. The jungle swallowed everything. Over time, night became a psychological weapon. Japanese soldiers grew exhausted from sleeplessness, forced to stay alert until dawn. Fear replaced routine. Shadows felt hostile. Every sound suggested danger. Guadalcanal taught a brutal lesson. The Americans did not fear the night. They owned it. And for those facing them, darkness became synonymous with death. On Guadalcanal, fear was not always triggered by gunfire. It was born from uncertainty. Japanese soldiers soon realized that the most dangerous American attacks were the ones they could not see. The jungle amplified this terror. Sounds carried strangely beneath the canopy. A snapped branch might echo like footsteps. A distant cough could seem dangerously close. At night, whispers, rustling leaves, and sudden movement created the constant illusion of encirclement. Many Japanese veterans later described hearing Americans without ever seeing them. A patrol would move through an area, leave no trace, and then strike somewhere else entirely. This pattern shattered any sense of control. Defensive positions felt meaningless when the enemy refused to remain in one place. Perhaps most unsettling was how American Marines seemed to disappear. After brief, violent contact, they withdrew silently into the jungle. No pursuit followed.
No visible retreat.
Japanese units would advance cautiously, only to find empty ground and bodies left behind. The enemy had vanished, as if absorbed by the forest itself. This invisibility wore down morale. Soldiers slept lightly, if at all. Constant alertness led to mistakes, hallucinations, and panic. Some fired into darkness at imagined threats, wasting ammunition and revealing positions. Others froze, afraid to move at all. The jungle became a psychological prison. American commanders understood this effect and exploited it. By remaining unseen, striking unpredictably, and refusing to hold obvious positions, U.S. forces turned fear into a weapon. Guadalcanal proved that an enemy you cannot see is far more terrifying than one you can fight, and for many Japanese soldiers, the jungle itself seemed to be fighting against them. The tactics that had once brought Japan rapid victories began to fail in the jungles of Guadalcanal. Japanese doctrine emphasized aggressive mass assaults, tight formations, and decisive frontal attacks. In China and Southeast Asia, these methods often overwhelmed opponents. On Guadalcanal, they led men directly into disaster. The dense jungle broke formations apart almost immediately. Units lost visual contact within seconds of movement. Orders shouted from the rear never reached the front. Officers struggled to control their men as vines, ravines, and darkness swallowed entire platoons. What was meant to be a coordinated attack often dissolved into isolated groups advancing blindly. Massed attacks proved especially costly. Japanese soldiers charged through narrow jungle trails and tall grass, unaware of American firing positions. Hidden Marines waited patiently, then opened fire at close range. Machine guns and rifles cut down attackers before they could even identify the source of fire. Assaults that relied on momentum collapsed within moments. Coordination between units became nearly impossible. Radios failed in the humidity, batteries corroded, and signal runners were killed or lost. Artillery support was unreliable due to poor visibility and inaccurate targeting. Attacks meant to strike simultaneously arrived late, early, or not at all. Instead of overwhelming the Americans, Japanese forces fed themselves into combat piece by piece. As casualties mounted, confidence eroded. Officers who once trusted doctrine began to doubt it. Soldiers who believed in decisive attacks now faced invisible enemies who refused open battle. Guadalcanal exposed a harsh reality. Courage alone could not defeat an opponent who had mastered the terrain. In the jungle, flexibility mattered more than tradition, and Japan's old methods could not adapt fast enough. At Guadalcanal, American forces embraced a form of warfare that felt more like hunting than traditional combat. Rather than holding ground at all costs, Marines focused on mobility, surprise, and survival. This approach resembled guerrilla warfare, fast strikes followed by immediate withdrawal into the jungle before the enemy could respond. Hit-and-run attacks became routine. Small Marine units struck Japanese positions, supply columns, and patrols, then disappeared along pre-planned escape routes. These engagements were brief, but violent. The goal was not annihilation, but exhaustion. Every successful raid forced Japanese units to stay alert, reposition defenses, and burn precious energy. Just as important was the constant pressure. Marines made sure the enemy never felt secure. Day patrols probed defensive lines. Night raids shattered sleep. Snipers fired a single shot, then vanished. Even when Americans were not attacking, the threat of attack remained. Japanese soldiers could never be certain when or where contact would occur. This strategy slowly strangled Japanese effectiveness. Fatigue dulled reaction time. Hunger weakened bodies. Fear damaged morale. Men began to hesitate, questioning orders and second-guessing movements. Commanders struggled to regain control over units that were constantly disrupted. American forces accepted the risks of operating in small numbers because the jungle protected them. Knowledge of terrain, careful planning, and discipline allowed them to survive where larger forces could not. Guadalcanal demonstrated that victory did not always belong to the strongest army, but to the one that could adapt, endure, and apply relentless pressure without ever standing still. For Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal, defeat did not come all at once. It arrived slowly, through hunger, illness, and despair. American control of the air and sea turned Japan's supply system into a lifeline that was constantly cut. Food, ammunition, and medicine often failed to reach frontline units. What supplies did arrive were sometimes dropped at night or unloaded under fire, leaving much of it lost in the jungle. Soldiers survived on half rations, then quarter rations, and eventually almost nothing. Starvation weakened bodies and minds. Men who once marched confidently could barely stand. Malaria, dysentery, and fungal infections spread rapidly in the humid climate. Medical units lacked supplies, and wounded soldiers were often left untreated. Many died without ever seeing the enemy. Fear became a constant companion. The jungle never rested. American patrols, snipers, and night raids ensured that sleep was rare and unsafe. Soldiers lived in shallow foxholes, soaked by rain and surrounded by insects. Every sound suggested danger. Over time, exhaustion blurred reality.
Morale collapsed.
Letters home stopped. Orders felt meaningless. Some soldiers withdrew deeper into the jungle, cut off from command entirely. Others lost the will to fight, waiting quietly for death. Even officers admitted that discipline alone could not overcome hunger and disease. Guadalcanal was not just a military defeat for Japan, it was a human collapse. The battlefield stripped soldiers of strength, hope, and purpose. In the end, many were not defeated by American bullets, but by the relentless combination of isolation, starvation, and fear. Guadalcanal forced Japan's military leadership to confront a reality it had badly misjudged. Before the campaign, American soldiers were often dismissed as inexperienced, undisciplined, and overly dependent on technology. After months of brutal fighting, that belief could no longer survive. Reports from surviving officers painted a very different picture. Japanese commanders noted the Americans' ability to adapt quickly. U.S. units changed tactics without hesitation, abandoned rigid doctrine, and learned from every engagement. Mistakes were analyzed, not repeated. This flexibility stood in sharp contrast to Japanese methods, which emphasized obedience and tradition over adjustment. There was also growing respect for American endurance. Despite heavy casualties, disease, and harsh conditions, U.S. forces did not withdraw. They dug in, rotated units, and maintained pressure day and night. Japanese intelligence reports began to describe American troops as patient, methodical, and dangerously persistent. Fear accompanied this respect. Commanders acknowledged that American control of logistics, artillery, and air power made prolonged engagements unwinnable. More troubling was the psychological impact. Americans seemed comfortable in chaos. They did not rely on dramatic charges or visible heroics. Instead, they fought quietly, efficiently, and without hesitation. By the end of the campaign, Japanese leadership reached a painful conclusion. American soldiers were not ordinary opponents. They were adaptable, well-supported, and mentally resilient. Guadalcanal marked the moment when Japan stopped underestimating the United States and began fighting a war it could no longer control. The battle for Guadalcanal left a profound mark on military strategy and doctrine in the Pacific War. For the United States, the campaign proved that jungle warfare required flexibility, patience, and innovation. Traditional European-style tactics, massed assaults, and rigid formations were ineffective in dense, humid forests where visibility was limited and the terrain favored stealth and adaptability. American commanders revised training, emphasizing small unit operations, reconnaissance, ambush tactics, and night patrolling. Marines learned that controlling the enemy's mind through unpredictability was as important as controlling the terrain itself. The lessons extended beyond the Marines. Supply lines, intelligence networks, and medical support became central to sustaining prolonged jungle campaigns. Guadalcanal highlighted how disease, starvation, and fatigue could debilitate even the strongest units. Future operations across the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and beyond integrated these insights, with planners focusing on mobility, rotation of forces, and logistical resilience. For the Japanese, the defeat forced a bitter reassessment. Their early confidence in traditional tactics and spiritual resolve had failed against adaptable and persistent U.S. forces. Guadalcanal revealed that technology, training, and psychological endurance mattered as much as courage and discipline. Japanese commanders were forced to acknowledge that the Americans were no ordinary soldiers and that prolonged confrontations in jungle terrain could no longer rely on sheer aggression alone. Ultimately, Guadalcanal shaped the Pacific War. It became a proving ground for jungle combat doctrine, a lesson in the value of small unit tactics, and a demonstration of the importance of morale and endurance. Its legacy endured in every subsequent Allied campaign, reminding both sides that in the jungle, the environment was as formidable an enemy as any soldier, and only those who adapted could sue.